Hi, I'm Grace, and I'll be reading House of Flowers, a short story by Truman Capote. Audley should have been the happiest girl in Port-au-Prince. As Baby said to her, "Look at all the things that can be put to your credit." "Like what?" said Audley, for she was vain and preferred compliments to pork or perfume. "Like your looks," said Baby. "You have a lovely light color, even almost blue eyes, and such a pretty sweet face." There was no girl on the road with steadier customers, every one of them ready to buy you all the beer you can drink. Audley conceded that this was true, and with a smile continued to total her fortunes. "I have 5 silk dresses and a pair of green satin shoes. I have 3 gold teeth worth 30,000 francs. Maybe Mr. Jameson or someone will give me another bracelet." "But Baby," she sighed, and could not express her discontent. Baby was her best friend. She had another friend too, Rosita. Baby was like a wheel, round, rolling. Junk rings had left green circles on several of her fat fingers. Her teeth were dark as burnt tree stumps, and when she laughed, you could hear her at sea, at least so the sailors claimed. Rosita, the other friend, was taller than most men and stronger. At night, with the customers on hand, she minced about, lisping in a silly doll voice, but in the daytime, she took spacious, loping strides and spoke out in a military baritone. Both of Audley's friends were from the Dominican Republic, and considered it reason enough to feel themselves a cut above the natives of this darker country. It did not concern them that Audley was a native. "You have brains," Baby told her, and certainly what Baby doted on was a good brain. Audley was afraid that her friends would discover that she could neither read nor write. The house where they lived and worked was rickety, thin as a steeple, frosted with fragile bougainvillea balconies. Though there was no sign outside, it was called the Champs-Elysees. The proprietress, a spinsterish, smothered-looking invalid, ruled from an upstairs room, where she stayed locked away, rocking in a rocking chair and drinking 10 to 20 Coca-Colas a day. All counted, she had 8 ladies working for her. With the exception of Audley, no one of them was under 30. In the evening, when the ladies assembled on the porch where they chattered and flourished paper fans that beat the air like delirious moths, Audley seemed a delightful, dreaming child, surrounded by older, uglier sisters. Her mother was dead. Her father was a planter who had gone back to France. She had been brought up in the mountains by a rough peasant family, the sons of whom had each at a young age lain with her in some green and shadowy place. 3 years earlier, when she was 14, she had come down for the first time to the market in Port-au-Prince. It was a journey of 2 days and a night, and she'd walked carrying a 10-pound sack of grain. To ease the load, she'd let a little of the grain spill out, then a little more, and by the time she had reached the market, there was almost none left. Audley had cried because she thought of how angry the family would be when she came home without the money for the grain, but these tears were not for long. Such a jolly nice man helped her dry them. He bought her a slice of coconut and took her to see his cousin, who was the proprietress at the Champs-Elysees. Audley could not believe her good luck. The jukebox music, the satin shoes, and joking men were as strange and marvelous as the electric light bulb in her room, which she never tired of clicking on and off. Soon she had become the most talked-of girl on the road. The proprietress was able to ask double for her, and Audley grew vain. She could pose for hours in front of a mirror. It was seldom that she thought of the mountains, and yet after 3 years, there was much of the mountains still with her. Their winds seemed still to move around her. Her hard, high haunches were not softened, nor had the soles of her feet, which were rough as a lizard's hide. When her friends spoke of love, of men they had loved, Audley became sulky. "How do you feel if you're in love?" she asked. "Ah," said Rosita with swooning eyes, You feel as though pepper has been sprinkled on your heart, as though tiny fish are swimming in your veins. Audley shook her head. If Rosita was telling the truth, then she had never been in love, for she had never felt that way about any of the men who came to the house. This so troubled her that at last she went to see a Houngan who lived in the hills above town. Unlike her friends, Audley did not tack Christian pictures on the walls of her room. She did not believe in God, but many gods, of food, light, of death, ruin. The Houngan was in touch with these gods. He kept their secrets on his altar, could hear their voices in the rattle of a gourd, could dispense their power in a potion. Speaking through the gods, the Houngan gave her this message. You must catch a wild bee, he said, and hold it in your closed hand. If the bee does not sting, then you will know you have found love. On the way home, she thought of Mr. Jameson. He was a man past 50, an American connected with an engineering project. The gold bracelets chattering on her wrists were presents from him, and Audley, passing a fence snowy with honeysuckle, wondered if after all she was not in love with Mr. Jameson. Black bees festooned the honeysuckle. With a brave thrust of her hand, she caught one dozing. Its stab was like a blow that knocked her to her knees. And there she knelt, weeping until it was hard to know whether the bee had stung her hand or her eyes. It was March, and events were leading toward Carnival. At the Champs-Elysees, the ladies were sewing on their costumes. Audley's hands were idle, for she had decided not to wear a costume at all. On Rah-Rah week ends, when drums sounded at the rising moon, she sat at her window and watched with a wandering mind the little bands of singers dancing and drumming their way along the road. She listened to the whistling and the laughter and felt no desire to join in. Somebody would think you were 1,000 years old, said Baby, and Rosita said, Audley, why don't you come to the cockfight with us? She was not speaking of an ordinary cockfight. From all parts of the island, contestants had arrived, bringing their fiercest birds. Audley thought she might as well go, and screwed a pair of pearls into her ears. When they arrived, the exhibition was already underway. In a great tent, a sea-sized crowd sobbed and shouted, while a second crowd, those who could not get in, thronged on the outskirts. Entry was no problem to ladies from the Champs-Elysees. A policeman friend cut a path for them and made room on a bench by the ring. The country people surrounding them seemed embarrassed to find themselves in such stylish company. They looked shyly at Baby's lacquered nails, the rhinestone combs in Rosita's hair, the glow of Audley's pearl earrings. However, the fights were exciting, and the ladies were soon forgotten. Baby was annoyed that this should be so, and her eyes rolled about, searching for glances in their direction. Suddenly she nudged Audley. Audley, she said, you've got an admirer. See that boy over there? He's staring at you like you were something cold to drink. At first, she thought he must be someone she knew, for he was looking at her as though she should recognize him. But how could she know him when she'd never known anyone so beautiful, anyone with such long legs, little ears? She could see that he was from the mountains. His straw country hat and the worn-out blue of his thick shirt told her as much. He was a ginger color, his skin shiny as a lemon, smooth as a guava leaf, and the tilt of his head was as arrogant as the black and scarlet bird he held in his hands. Audley was used to boldly smiling at men, but now her smile was fragmentary. It clung to her lips like cake crumbs. Eventually there was an intermission. The arena was cleared, and all who could crowded into it to dance and stamp, while an orchestra of drums and strings sang out carnival tunes. It was then that the young man approached Audley. She laughed to see his bird perched like a parrot on his shoulder. "Off with you," said Baby, outraged that a peasant should ask Audley to dance. And Rosita rose menacingly, to stand between the young man and her friend. He only smiled and said, "Please, madame, I would like to speak with your daughter." Audley felt herself being lifted, felt her hips meet against his to the rhythm of music, and she did not mind at all. She let him lead her into the thickest tangle of dancers. Rosita said, "Did you hear that? He thought I was her mother." And Baby, consoling her, grimly said, "After all, what do you expect? They're only natives, both of them. When she comes back, we'll just pretend we don't know her." As it happened, Audley did not return to her friends. Royal, this was the young man's name, Royal Bonaparte, he told her, had not wanted to dance. "We must walk in a quiet place," he said. "Hold my hand, and I will take you." She thought him strange, but did not feel strange with him. For the mountains were still with her, and he was of the mountains. With her hands together, and the iridescent cock swaying on his shoulder, they left the tent and wandered lazily down a white road, then along a soft lane where birds of sunlight fluttered through the greenness of leaning acacia trees. "I have been sad," he said, not looking sad. "In my village, Juno is a champion, but the birds here are strong and ugly, and if I let him fight, I would only have a dead Juno. So I will take him home and say that he won. Audley, will you have a dip of snuff?" She sneezed voluptuously. Snuff reminded her of her childhood, and mean as those years had been, nostalgia touched her with its far-reaching wand. "Royal," she said, "be still a minute. I want to take off my shoes." Royal himself did not have shoes. His golden feet were slender and airy, and the prints they left were like the track of a delicate animal. He said, "How is it that I find you here, in all the world here, where nothing is good, where rum is bad and the people thieves? Why did I find you here, Audley?" "Because I must make my way, the same as you, and here there is a place for me. I work in a, kind of hotel. We have our own place," he said, "all the side of a hill, and there at the top of the hill is my cool house. Audley, will you come and sit inside?" "Crazy," said Audley, teasing him, "crazy," and she ran between the trees, and he was after her, his arms out as though he held a net. The bird Juno flared his wings, crowed, flew to the ground. Scratchy leaves and fur of moss thrilled the soles of Audley's feet as she lifted through the shade and shadows. Abruptly, in a veil of rainbow fern, she fell with a thorn in her heel. She winced when Royal pulled out the thorn. He kissed the place where it had been, his lips moved to her hands, her throat, and it was as though she were among drifting leaves. She breathed the odor of him, the dark, clean smell that was like the root of things, of geraniums, of heavy trees. "Now that's enough," she pleaded, though she did not feel that this was so. It was only that after an hour of him, her heart was about to give out. He was quiet then, his tickly-haired head raised above her heart. "And shoo," she said to the gnats that clustered about his sleeping eyes. "Shush," she said to Juno, who pranced around, crowing at the sky. While she lay there, Audley saw her old enemy, the bees. Silently, in a line like ants, the bees were crawling in and out of a broken stump that stood not far from her. She loosened herself from Royal's arms and smoothed a place on the ground for his head. Her hand was trembling as she lay it in the path of the bees, but the first that came along tumbled into her palm, and when she closed her fingers, it made no move to hurt her. She counted 10, just to be sure, then opened her hand, and the bee, in a spiraling arc, climbed the air with a joyful singing. The proprietress gave Baby and Rosita a piece of advice. Leave her alone. Let her go. A few weeks and she will be back. The proprietress spoke in the calm of defeat. To keep Audley with her, she'd offered the best room in the house, a new gold tooth, a Kodak, an electric fan, but Audley had not wavered. She had gone right on putting her belongings in a cardboard box. Baby tried to help, but she was crying so much that Audley had to stop her. It was bound to be bad luck, all those tears falling on a bride's possessions. And to Rosita she said, "Rosita, you ought to be glad for me instead of standing there wringing your hands." It was only 2 days after the cockfight that Royal shouldered Audley's cardboard box and walked her in the dusk toward the mountains. When it was learned that she was no longer at the Champs-Elysees, many of the customers took their trade elsewhere. Others, though remaining loyal to the old place, complained of a gloom in the atmosphere. Some evenings, there was hardly anyone to buy the ladies a beer. Gradually, it began to be felt that Audley, after all, would not come back. At the end of 6 months, the proprietress said, "She must be dead." Royal's house was like a house of flowers. Wisteria sheltered the roof. A curtain of vines shaded the windows. Lilies bloomed at the door. From the windows, one could see far, faint winkings of the sea, as the house was high up on a hill. Here the sun burned hot, but the shadows were cold. Inside, the house was always dark and cool, and the walls rustled with pasted pink and green newspapers. There was only one room. It contained a stove, a teetering mirror on a top marble table, and a brass bed big enough for 3 fat men. But Audley did not sleep in this grand bed. She was not allowed even to sit upon it, for it was the property of Royal's grandmother, old Bonaparte. A charred, lumpy creature, bow-legged as a dwarf and bald as a buzzard. Old Bonaparte was much respected for miles around as a maker of spells. There were many who were afraid to have her shadow fall upon them. Even Royal was wary of her, and he stuttered when he told her that he'd brought home a wife. Motioning Audley to her, the old woman bruised her here and there with vicious little pinches, and informed her grandson that his bride was too skinny. She will die with her first. Each night, the young couple waited to make love until they thought old Bonaparte was gone to sleep. Sometimes, stretched on the straw moonlit pallet where they slept, Audley was sure that old Bonaparte was awake and watching them. Once, she saw a gummy, star-struck eye shining in the dark. There was no use complaining to Royal. He only laughed. What harm was there in an old woman who had seen so much of life wanting to see a little more? Because she loved Royal, Audley put away her grievances and tried not to resent old Bonaparte. For a long while, she was happy. She did not miss her friends or the life in Port-au-Prince. Even so, she kept her souvenirs of those days in good repair. With the sewing basket Baby had given her as a wedding gift, she mended the silk dresses, the green silk stockings that now she never wore, for there was no place to wear them. Only men congregated at the cafe in the village at the cockfights. When women wanted to meet, they met at the washing stream. But Audley was too busy to be lonesome. At daybreak, she gathered eucalyptus leaves to start a fire and begin their meals. There were chickens to feed, a goat to be milked. There was old Bonaparte's whining for attention. 3 and 4 times a day she filled a bucket of drinking water and carried it to where Royal worked in the cane fields, a mile below the house. She did not mind that on these visits he was gruff with her. She knew that he was showing off before the other men who worked in the fields, and who grinned at her like split watermelons. But at night, when she had him home, she'd pull his ears and pout that he treated her like a dog, until in the dark of the yard where the fireflies flamed, he would hold her and whisper something to make her smile. They had been married about 5 months when Royal began doing the things he'd done before his marriage. Other men went to the cafe in the evenings, stayed whole Sundays at a cockfight. He couldn't understand why Audley should carry on about it, but she said he had no right behaving the way he did, and that if he loved her, he wouldn't leave her alone day and night with the mean old woman. "I love you," he said, "but a man has to have his pleasures too." There were nights when he pleasured himself until the moon was in the middle of the sky. She never knew when he was coming home, and she would lie fretting on the pallet, imagining she could not sleep without his arms around her. But old Bonaparte was the real torment. She was about to worry Audley out of her mind. If Audley was cooking, the terrible old woman was sure to come poking around the stove, and when she did not like what there was to eat, she would take a mouthful and spit it on the floor. Every mess she could think of she made. She wet the bed, insisted on having the goat in the room. Whatever she touched was soon spilled or broken, and to Royal she complained that a woman who couldn't keep a nice house for her husband was worthless. She was underfoot the whole day, and her red, remorseless eyes were seldom shut. But the worst of it, the thing that finally made Audley threaten to kill her, was the old woman's habit of sneaking up from nowhere and pinching her so hard you could see the fingernail marks. "If you do that one more time, if you just dare, I'll snatch that knife and cut out your heart." Old Bonaparte knew Audley meant it, and though she stopped the pinching, she thought of other jokes. For instance, she made a point of walking all over a certain part of the yard, pretending she did not know that Audley had planted a little garden there. One day, 2 exceptional things happened. A boy came from the village bringing a letter for Audley. At the Champs-Elysees, postcards had once in a while arrived from sailors and other traveling men who had spent pleasant moments with her, but this was the first letter she'd ever received. Since she could not read it, her first impulse was to tear it up. There was no use having it hang around to haunt her. Of course, there was a chance that someday she would learn to read, and so she went to hide it in her sewing basket. When she opened the sewing basket, she made a sinister discovery. There, like a gruesome ball of yarn, was the severed head of a yellow cat. So, the miserable old woman was up to new tricks. "She wants to put a spell," thought Audley, not in the least frightened. Primly lifting the head by one of its ears, she carried it to the stove and dropped it into the boiling pot. At noon, old Bonaparte sucked her teeth and remarked that the soup Audley had made for her was surprisingly tasty. The next morning, just in time for the midday meal, she found twisting in her basket a small green snake, which, chopping fine as sand, she sprinkled into a serving of stew. Each day her ingenuity was tested. There were spiders to bake, a lizard to fry, a buzzard's breast to boil. Old Bonaparte ate several helpings of everything. With a restless glittering, her eyes followed Audley as she watched for some sign that the spell was taking hold. "You don't look well, Audley," she said, mixing a little molasses in the vinegar of her voice. "You eat like an ant. Here now, why don't you have a bowl of this good soup?" "Because," answered Audley evenly, "I don't like buzzard in my soup, or spiders in my bread, snakes in my stew. I have no appetite for such things." Old Bonaparte understood. With swelling veins and a stricken, powerless tongue, she rose shakily to her feet, then crashed across the table. Before nightfall, she was dead. Royal summoned mourners. They came from the village, from the neighboring hills, and wailing like dogs at midnight, laid siege to the house. Old women beat their heads against the walls, moaning men prostrated themselves. It was the art of sorrow, and those who best mimicked grief were much admired. After the funeral, everyone went away, satisfied that they'd done a good job. Now the house belonged to Audley. Without old Bonaparte's prying and her mess to clean, she had more spare time, but she did not know what to do with it. She sprawled on the great brass bed. She loafed in front of the mirror. Monotony hummed in her head, and to drive away its fly-buzz sound, she would sing the songs she'd learned from the jukebox at the Champs-Elysees. Waiting in the twilight for Royal, she would remember that at this hour, her friends in Port-au-Prince were gossiping on the porch and waiting for the turning headlights of a car. But when she saw Royal ambling up the path, his cane cutter swinging at his side like a crescent moon, she forgot such thoughts and ran with a satisfied heart to meet him. One night, as they lay half drowsing, Audley felt suddenly another presence in the room. Then, gleaming there at the foot of the bed, she saw, as she had seen before, a watching eye. Thus she knew what for some time she had suspected, that old Bonaparte was dead but not gone. Once, when she was alone in the house, she'd heard a laugh, and once again, out in the yard, she'd seen the goat gazing at someone who was not there, and twinkling his ears as he did whenever the old woman scratched his skull. "Stop shaking the bed," said Royal, and Audley, with a finger raised at the eye, whisperingly asked him if he could not see it. When he replied that she was dreaming, she reached for the eye and screamed at feeling only air. Royal lighted a lamp. He cuddled Audley on his lap and smoothed her hair while she told him of the discoveries she'd made in her sewing basket and of how she had disposed of them. Was it wrong what she'd done? Royal did not know. It was not for him to say, but it was his opinion that she would have to be punished. And why? Because the old woman wanted it. Because she would otherwise never leave Audley in peace. That is the way with haunts. In accordance with this, Royal fetched a rope the next morning and proposed to tie Audley to a tree in the yard. There she was to remain until dark without food or water, and anyone passing would know her to be in a state of disgrace. But Audley crawled under the bed and refused to come out. "I'll run away," she whimpered. "Royal, if you try to tie me to that old tree, I'll run away." "Then I'd have to go and get you," said Royal, "and that would be the worse for you." He gripped her by an ankle and dragged her squealing from under the bed. All the way to the yard she caught at things, the door, a vine, the goat's beard, but none of these would hold her, and Royal was not detained from tying her to the tree. He made 3 knots in the rope and went off to work sucking his hand where she had bit him. She hollered at him all the bad words she'd ever heard until he disappeared over the hill. The goat, Juno, and the chickens gathered to stare at her humiliation. Slumping to the ground, Audley stuck out her tongue at them. Because she was almost asleep, Audley thought it was a dream when, in the company of a child from the village, Baby and Rosita, wobbling on high heels and carrying fancy umbrellas, tottered up the path calling her name. Since they were people in a dream, they probably would not be surprised to find her tied to a tree. "My God, are you mad?" shrieked Baby, keeping her distance as though she feared that indeed this must be the case. "Speak to us, Audley." Blinking, giggling, Audley said, "I'm just as happy to see you. Rosita, please untie me so that I can hug you both." "So this is what the brute does," said Rosita, tearing at the ropes. "Wait till I see him, beating you and tying you in the yard like a dog." "Oh no," said Audley. "Royal never beats me. It's just that today I'm being punished." "You wouldn't listen to us," said Baby, "and now you see what's come of it. That man has plenty to answer for, she added, brandishing her umbrella. Audley hugged her friends and kissed them. Isn't it a pretty house? She said, leading them toward it. It's like you picked a wagon of flowers and built a house with them. That is what I think. Come in out of the sun. It's cool inside and smells so sweet. Rosita sniffed as though what she smelled was nothing sweet, and in her well-bottomed voice declared that, yes, it was better that they stay out of the sun, as it seemed to be affecting Audley's head. It's a mercy that we've come, said Baby, fishing inside an enormous purse, and you can thank Mr. Jameson for that. Madame said you were dead, and when you never answered our letter, we thought it must be so. But Mr. Jameson, that's the loveliest man you'll ever know. He hired a car for me and Rosita, your dearest loving friends, to come up here and find out what happened to our Audley. Audley, I've got a bottle of rum here in my purse, so get us a glass and we'll all have a round. The elegant foreign manners and flashing finery of the city ladies had intoxicated their guide, a little boy whose peaking black eyes bobbed at the window. Audley was impressed, too, for it was a long time since she'd seen painted lips or smelled bottled perfume, and while Baby poured the rum, she got out her satin shoes, her pearl earrings. Dear, said Rosita when Audley had finished dressing up, there's no man alive that wouldn't buy you a whole keg of beer. To think of it, a gorgeous piece like you suffering far away from those who love you. I haven't been suffering so much, said Audley. Just sometimes. Hush now, said Baby. You don't have to talk about it yet. It's all over anyway. Here, dear, let me see your glass again. A toast to old times, and those to be. Tonight, Mr. Jameson is going to buy champagne for everybody. Madame is letting him have it at half price. Oh, said Audley, envying her friends. Well, she wanted to know, what did people say of her? Was she remembered? Audley, you have no idea, said Baby. Men nobody ever laid eyes on before have come into the place, asking, where is Audley? Because they've heard about you way off in Havana and Miami. As for Mr. Jameson, he doesn't even look at us other girls, just comes and sits on the porch drinking by himself. Yes, said Audley wistfully. He was always sweet to me, Mr. Jameson. Presently the sun was slanting, and the bottle of rum stood 3/4 empty. A thunderburst of rain had for a moment drenched the hills that now, seen through the windows, shimmered like dragonfly wings, and a breeze, rich with the scent of rain-dawn flowers, roamed the room, rustling the green and pink papers on the walls. Many stories had been told, some of them funny, a few that were sad. It was like any night's talk at the Champs-Elysees, and Audley was happy to be a part of it again. But it's getting late, said Baby, and we promised to be back before midnight. Audley, can we help you pack? Although she had not realized that her friends expected her to leave with them, the rum stirring in her made it seem a likely assumption, and with a smile she thought, I told him I would not go away. Only, she said aloud, it's not like I would have even a week to enjoy myself. Royal will come right down and get me. Both her friends laughed at this. You're so silly, said Baby. I'd like to see that Royal when some of our men got through with him. I wouldn't stand for anybody hurting Royal, said Audley. Besides, he'd be even madder when he got home. Baby said, but Audley, you wouldn't be coming back here with him. Audley giggled and looked about the room as though she saw something invisible to the others. Why, sure I would, she said. Rolling her eyes, Baby produced a fan and jerked it in front of her face. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard," she said between hard lips. "Isn't that the craziest thing you've ever heard, Rosita?" "It's that Audley's been through so much," said Rosita. "Dear, why don't you lie down on the bed while we pack your things?" Audley watched as they commenced piling her possessions. They scooped her combs and pins. They wound up her silk stockings. She took off her pretty clothes as if she were going to put on something finer still. Instead, she slipped back into her old dress. Then, working quietly, and as though she were helping her friends, she put everything back where it belonged. Baby stamped her foot when she saw what was happening. "Listen," said Audley. "If you and Rosita are my friends, please do what I tell you. Tie me in the yard just like I was when you came. That way, no bee is ever going to sting me." "Stinking drunk," said Baby. But Rosita told her to shut up. "I think," said Rosita with a sigh, "I think Audley is in love." If Royal wanted her back, she would go with him, and this is being the way things were, they might as well go home and say that Madame was right, that Audley was dead. "Yes," said Audley, for the drama of it appealed to her. "Tell them that I am dead." So they went into the yard. There, with heaving bosoms and eyes as round as the daytime moon scudding above, Baby said she would have no part in tying Audley to the tree, which left Rosita to do it alone. On parting, it was Audley who cried the most, though she was glad to see them go, for she knew that as soon as they were gone, she would not think of them again. Teetering on their high heels down the dips of the path, they turned to wave, but Audley could not wave back, and so she forgot them before they were out of sight. Chewing eucalyptus leaves to sweeten her breath, she felt the chill of twilight twitch the air. Yellow deepened the daytime moon, and roosting birds sailed into the darkness of the tree. Suddenly, hearing Royal on the path, she threw her legs akimbo, let her neck go limp, lulled her eyes far back into their sockets. Seen from a distance, it would look as though she had come to some violent, pitiful end, and listening to Royal's footsteps quicken to a run, she happily thought, "This will give him a good scare." And that's the end. Thank you for watching.